Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird unforgotten history. I'm Chris. I'm excited to be starting a series talking about Fordham University, its history, its lore, its urban legends, and its hauntings. And I would argue that Fordham University in the Bronx is an area that has one of the greatest concentrations of hauntings and dark history in all of New York City. Fordham happens to be my alma mater, so I'll also be talking a little bit about my own personal experiences of the paranormal at Fordham during this series. Fordham University is known as one of the most haunted universities in the United States, and the Fordham hauntings are kind of bananas. And in addition to all the stories of hauntings and ghost stories, etc., the campus has so many creepy elements in its history. So since this is the first episode in the series, I wanted to spin through a few of those topics just so you know what's coming up and some of the things you can look forward to hearing about in this series. So Fordham has a ton of stories of encounters with ghostly priests, in many cases where the person didn't realize they were speaking to someone who was deceased until someone else told them later on. There's a case of what seems like a ghost priest possibly performing an exorcism. There's an entire dorm on Fordham's campus, which I lived in, and which most of my on-campus paranormal experiences happened in, that used to be a medical school building, and it contained a medical amphitheater for demonstrating operations, etc., and also, I assume, cadaver dissections. And you can actually see where the amphitheater was in that building by looking at it on Google Satellite View. It was a big part of the building. And cadavers, of course, were kept in the basement of that building, and the location of that building was even supposedly selected for ease of cadaver transportation. It's right on the edge of campus, all the easier to get the cadavers in and out. There's a series of secret underground tunnels connecting the campus's oldest buildings. There was an old hospital that was leveled to become the university's parking lot. There are stories of black dogs, ghost children, poltergeist activity. There's even a cemetery on campus where the bodies have been disinterred and moved not once, but twice. And now a dorm is built on top of one of those past locations. Also, right near that cemetery, there is a forgotten burial ground that was discovered while a dorm was being built. So kind of all the good paranormal and ghost story archetypes, sort of, are reflected in the Fordham hauntings. Part of The Exorcist was even filmed on campus. Edgar Allan Poe used to hang out on campus. All sorts of things that are related to the strange, the spooky, the macabre are all tied up in Fordham's history. Also, I would like to make a claim here that I don't think has been made before, which is, I believe that Fordham University is New York City's most haunted half-mile. I would like to challenge my fellow New Yorkers to find an area of similar size that has a similar level of hauntings and creepy history. And to explain my methodology here, I went on Google Earth and measured Fordham's campus using the Google Earth measurement tool. The campus is shaped like a sideways triangle pointing eastwards. So I measured the longest part of the point and the middle of the slanting sides. So the campus is about 0.51 miles wide and 0.33 miles tall. So about half a mile wide, about a third of a mile tall. I will put these screen grabs of the measurements in the show notes for this episode so you can take a look at that and see how I measured. But it's a modest-sized campus and a pretty small area, I think, to have so many paranormal stories come out of it. I do think that the village near NYU and Washington Square Park might be able to give Fordham a run for its money, maybe, but I'm not convinced that there's an area of the village that is of a similar size to Fordham's campus that has a similar number of hauntings. I'll also include screen grabs in the show notes measuring out the same distance in the area around Washington Square Park, so you can see what I mean in terms of scale. But if anyone would like to challenge me on what New York City's most haunted half-mile would be, I would love to know of a similarly haunted area because I would love to research it, so please email me if you have a different candidate you'd like to put forth for New York City's most haunted half-mile. And it's one of those things I would actually love to be refuted on this, because it would mean that there's somewhere in New York City with even more hauntings in a small area. So please change my mind. But until then, I, a random podcaster, would like to declare Fordham University's Rose Hill campus as the most concentrated area of hauntings and dark history in all of New York City. So in characteristic form, I've done an enormous amount of research, so I don't know exactly how long this series will be. I am trying to write it in a way that you can kind of pick and choose if you don't want to listen to it all in order, though I think it will be better listening to it all in order. Right now I have about 9 episodes worth of notes, so this could end up being as long as the Ouija board series I did last year, but I'm going to try to combine some episodes, because with a bi-weekly publication schedule, 9 episodes will take a while. But if you're wondering why it's so long, of course there's a ton of hauntings, but if you're a longtime listener, you know that I'm not here to uncritically repeat ghost stories and urban legends. I, of course, want ghost stories to be true whenever I hear them, but I'm somewhat of a skeptical believer when it comes to the paranormal. When examining hauntings and stories of hauntings, I like to look really closely at the history of the area, of the building where the haunting occurred in, and any other factors that could have bearing on the story. So for example, if there's a detail in an urban legend, I like to do everything I can to corroborate that detail. At the end of the day, you can't really verify the veracity of a ghost story. So what you have to do is look at the story, look for holes in the story, look for specificity, and for details that you can confirm, which, to me, help to determine whether something is just a fun urban legend or whether it's something that might be somewhat credible. So that's a big part of why I have so much material here and so much I want to talk about. I'm all about getting the context and looking at things from all the possible angles, looking for patterns, etc. And my goal is to present this in a way that will be interesting to anyone who's into hauntings and urban legends, etc. But I do expect a number of Fordham people to listen to this. So I wanted to address Fordham folks real quick off the top. If you went to Fordham and you had a paranormal experience there and you want to share it, please let me know. I would love to hear your story. You can email me at buriedseekerspodcast@gmail.com. And so far, I've written this series just using information that I was able to find that had been published online or in one of the university's newspapers or in a book. And of course, I'll sprinkle in a few of my own experiences as well, but I would love to incorporate any other encounters with the paranormal that people have had, because I know there's got to be way more out there that just hasn't been published. So with that out of the way, in this episode, I want to talk about the dorm that I lived in freshman year, Queen's Court. I'll also talk about the university church, which has an Edgar Allan Poe connection, and I'll talk a little bit about the honors program building, Alpha House. All 3 of these are some of the older buildings on campus. But before I get into those specific buildings, let's get to some background info about what Fordham University is for folks who may not be familiar with the school. So if you don't live in the tri-state area or the northeastern part of the US, you may not have heard of Fordham University, but you have heard of its alumni, which include obviously the most important Fordham grad, Lana Del Rey, though there are questions about whether or not she graduated. But there are also famous graduates such as Denzel Washington, Alan Alda, Patricia Clarkson, Taylor Schilling, all actors. There are authors like Mary Higgins Clark and Don DeLillo. The former Green Bay Packers coach Vince Lombardi went there, and some politicians went there, including the disgraced former New York governor Andrew Cuomo, and also one Donald J. Trump, who attended Fordham for 2 years before transferring elsewhere. There's also been a number of different famous faculty members and lecturers, but the most interesting one for our purposes here is Carl Jung, who of course was highly influential in the paranormal world, and he wrote about alchemy, UFOs, etc., and his work still constantly referenced today in the paranormal. Jung gave a series of lectures at Fordham during a conference in 1912, and at that conference and during that series, he argued against some of Freud's theories, and that's supposedly the cause of their famous schism. So anyway, what is Fordham? Fordham University is a private Catholic college that's run by Jesuits. It's the 3rd oldest university in New York State. after NYU and Columbia, and it's the oldest Catholic institution of higher education in all of the Northeast. Fordham was originally founded in 1841 by Archbishop John Hughes, aka Dagger John. If you're interested in knowing more about Archbishop John Hughes, you should check out the 2 episodes I did on Calvary Cemetery, either earlier this year or late last year. In one of those episodes, I talk a lot about old Dagger John because he was an interesting and somewhat unpleasant historical figure. So John Hughes really liked to name things after himself. Any kind of institution he had a hand in, he tried to kind of sneak in a reference to himself. So of course, when he founded this college, he called it St. John's College. And at the time, it was both a seminary for training new priests and also a college. And of course, the seminary was called St. Joseph's because John Hughes' name was John Joseph Hughes. So he got a reference in for his first name and his middle name. A few years later, after its founding, the college would be purchased by a group of French Jesuits from Kentucky, and from then on, it was a Jesuit university. The name would be changed to Fordham University in 1907, and Fordham is the name of the neighborhood that the university is in, which was once the location of a farm called Fordham Manor. Fordham has a handful of campuses, including the one in the Bronx, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about here. It's the largest campus and the one that I lived on, and the Bronx campus is called Rose Hill. There's also a campus at Lincoln Center in Manhattan, near the southwest corner of Central Park. There are also some smaller campuses, including one in London, which I think is fairly new, and one in the suburbs of New York City in Westchester County. Most of Fordham's ghost stories are centered around the Rose Hill campus, though later in the series I will share what I was able to find out about Lincoln Center as well. And to set the stage a little bit more, while Rose Hill is located in the Bronx, it doesn't look like a campus in an urban area. It has a lot of green space and collegiate Gothic buildings. It's so pretty that it's often used as filming locations, especially if the script calls for a sort of unnamed, private, northeastern, fancy-looking school. The 3 most famous movies that were filmed at Fordham were A Beautiful Mind, Love Story, and of course, The Exorcist. Fordham's campus was a big attraction for me, as it is for many incoming students. It's great to be in New York, but also have this beautiful green campus as your sort of home base. But I was also very much drawn in by Fordham's ghost stories, because, like I said, it's considered one of the most haunted colleges in America, and I was excited to maybe have some strange experiences. While I did encounter some weird stuff there, it wasn't what I expected. I had hoped to meet a friendly Jesuit ghost in the library late at night who could help me with my homework, kind of in line with some of the most classic Fordham hauntings. But instead, I got a pretty typical grab bag of weird paranormal crap that I'm still turning over in my head and trying to decipher without much success, even after all this other research. So, as it's relevant, I'll pepper in my own experiences. They're definitely nothing as dramatic as some of the university's best ghost stories, but still weirdness that keeps bothering me to this day as I try to figure out what exactly was happening, what things meant, etc. So that's some basic background on the university. Let's talk about paranormal legends on campus. Fordham's an interesting school because it's pretty proud of its hauntings, and it acknowledges its hauntings. There are campus ghost tours, there's part of the library's website dedicated to chronicling Fordham's most famous hauntings, etc. I've searched extensively in the library's archives, in particular the newspaper archives for the student newspapers. There's the RAM, which is the Rose Hill campus's newspaper, and then there's the Observer, which is the Lincoln Center newspaper. And the first real mentions of the Fordham hauntings that I could find appear in the RAM, the Rose Hill student newspaper, starting in the 1970s. A lot of the best stories came from articles in the 70s and 80s. And again, it's worth noting that The Exorcist came out in 1973, I believe. So I am curious if that was perhaps a reason behind a resurgence in interest in the paranormal on campus. I guess not a resurgence if there wasn't an interest to begin with, but I wonder if that could have influenced this sudden interest in the paranormal on campus, and if it maybe tuned people in a little bit more to thinking of paranormal explanations for weird, unexplainable stuff that happened. Because I do think it's easy, if you're not super open to the potential existence of the paranormal, I think it's pretty easy to be like, oh, well, this weird thing happened, but it's not really anything, even if it's something with no real explanation. So it's my suspicion that The Exorcist probably had a little bit of an influence on the student body of Fordham suddenly being more interested in hauntings on campus. So let's talk about Queen's Court. Queen's Court is a dorm where I lived freshman year. It's a sort of, I guess, U-shaped building with a courtyard in the middle. It's made of 3 wings called St. John's Hall, Bishop's Hall, and St. Robert's Hall. St. Robert's Hall, I think, is technically called St. Robert Bellarmine Hall. Everyone calls it Robert's. Robert Bellarmine, if you're curious, is a saint from the 16th and 17th century who was big in the Counter-Reformation. He was a Jesuit cardinal. He also did a little bit of adjudicating in the Galileo affair, the whole heliocentrism versus geocentrism thing. And it sounds like he basically told Galileo, heliocentrism is fine as long as you treat it as a hypothetical theory and not a real thing. I think he was the guy who ended up delivering the Inquisition's injunction against Galileo, but it also sounds like they maybe remained on good terms. So that's the story behind St. Robert there. Anyway, back to Queen's Court. St. John's Hall was built, I think, right around 1845, shortly after St. John's College was founded. There's this great book from 1891 called A History of St. John's College, Fordham, New York, by Thomas Gaffney Taffy, or Taff maybe. It's Taaffe. Who knows how to pronounce that? And the book has these great descriptions of campus. I find them really delightfully romantic and fanciful in a very 19th century sort of way. So I wanted to read a little bit of what he wrote about the approach to St. John's Hall back in 1891. Turning your steps to the right, after a brief interval of flagged walk bordered by garden fence and shrubbery, you come to the most charming spot in this collection of noble buildings and picturesque surroundings. St. John's Hall, the preparatory school for small boys attached to the college, is situated at the extreme northwest of the college grounds. Adjoining it is the parish church of Fordham, the Church of Our Lady of Mercy. Church and hall were built in 1845 by Archbishop Hughes. The latter as a seminary for the education of priests in the Diocese of New York, and the former as the seminary chapel. Both buildings are of stone quarried on the college property, but different from that used in other buildings. So I wanted to pause for a second after reading that. First, I really wish he had phrased preparatory school for small boys in a slightly less creepy way, but that seemed to be like the way they referred to the prep school often back then. Kind of weird. Second, it's interesting, to me at least, to note that the stone for these buildings were quarried basically on site. I talk about this in some of my episodes about Roosevelt Island that I've done, but the idea of stone being quarried right near the buildings that are being built, for whatever reason, I find really interesting. And, it's the case for a decent number of older buildings in New York City, the Roosevelt Island buildings that I've talked about, buildings like St. John's Hall. And I was trying to figure out how to articulate why I find that so interesting. But maybe to me, it's the idea of a close connection to a place. Like there's something being built, but the materials are being taken out of the ground right there. So the raw materials aren't going that far, and it's kind of just taking something from underground and putting it above ground. I can't quite say why this interests me so much. It may just be tickling something in the back of my mind about elemental or land spirits, the idea of a building being tied really closely to the place where it stands, that I just can't quite articulate, but I thought it was worth mentioning here. I probably also tend to dwell on raw materials like stone when talking about haunted places, perhaps in part because of things like stone tape theory, which is this idea that residual hauntings are perhaps inscribed or recorded onto the stone around them as if the stone is like a tape recorder or something. And that a place sort of like has a memory of an event. And, if something particularly emotional or traumatic happens, the idea is that the stone kind of creates a record of it, like a tape being recorded. It's kind of an interesting theory because it is a Victorian theory that apparently only became popular because the BBC did a TV play in the 1970s, about stone tape theory, and now many people in the paranormal remain interested in stone tape theory. So who knows if stone tape theory is real or not, but that could be part of why it's so interesting to me when like a stone has been in a place for a long time and is a part of a building. It's almost as if like the memory of the raw materials stretches back even longer. I don't know. I know I'm rambling a little bit. But to get back to St. John's Hall, this 1891 book had a great description of what it looked like. I just wanted to read a bit of that. The hall is an imposing structure. The massive arched entrance, the old-fashioned latticed windows, the vine-covered walls, all combining to produce an effect at once grand and impressive. So after St. John's Hall was a seminary, which it was until 1860, the seminary was moved to Troy, New York, and the building was sold to the university, or the college, I guess. And apparently for a while they weren't really using St. John's Hall for anything. It was just used for chemistry and physics classes. But in 1885, they renovated the building and they turned it into the prep school. So this 1891 book about St. John's College goes on to talk about how there were beautiful gardens and a fountain in front of St. John's Hall. It also describes the floor plan of the hall a bit more, which I think is worth mentioning. Basically, there was a hallway running along the length of the building, and then the building contained a study hall, classrooms, dorm rooms, and then in the basement there was a gym and a drill room, whatever that is. I guess maybe it was used for the cadets, because I do know at different points in Fordham's history there were cadets on campus. And then in the back of the building, kind of facing where the railroad is, because the Metro North Railroad runs along the side of campus, there was a playground for the prep school students. Also, St. John's Hall was right next to the university church, and at one point they were even connected by what looks like some sort of hallway. I actually noticed that when I was a student because there's a really obvious part of St. John's Hall and a really obvious part of the church that are filled in with like a different material than the rest of the building. And I did find an old drawing that shows when they were connected. So it's almost like one big complex at one point. Moving on to the church, one of the most famous legends about the university church relates to Edgar Allan Poe, because no collection of ghost stories would be complete without Poe, right? I'm not going to get super into Edgar Allan Poe's life and biography, but if you want to learn more about that, you should check out the podcast Lunatics Radio Hour. They just did a couple episodes about Poe, one about his life and the other featuring his work. And those are great episodes. You should listen to them if you're interested in learning more about Edgar Allan Poe. But for our purposes here, Edgar Allan Poe moved to the Bronx in 1846. He lived in the neighborhood of Fordham. He used to walk over to campus and he would play cards and drink with the Jesuits. The bells of the university church supposedly inspired the Edgar Allan Poe poem, The Bells. Poe wrote The Bells in 1849. I wanted to read a little bit about Poe at Fordham, which, like I mentioned, was then called St. John's College, from a book called Fordham, A History and Memoir by Raymond A. Schroth. The poet found the new St. John's College, especially under the direction of the Jesuits, a most congenial place. The campus was not more than a 20-minute walk down the hill from the sparsely settled neighborhood where he and his ailing wife, Virginia, along with Virginia's mother, Mrs. Maria Clem, had settled into a small, white, 3-room cottage in the Kingbridge section. So then Virginia, his wife, died, and he fell into a deeper depression. And what he would do is he would go on long walks to deal with that. He apparently would wake up real early at 4 a.m. and he would walk around. He'd go to the Aqueduct Bridge, which, goes across the Harlem River. But a lot of the time he would go to St. John's College. And at the time, the area was mostly farms and sort of isolated houses. It was a pretty rural area. And to read a little bit more from the book, when Poe came in the early evening, around 6, he arrived in time for the Angelus. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm not good at Latin. I'm sorry. The great bells in the tower of the college church, which also served as the local Our Lady of Mercy parish, rung out in the traditional prayer. With the bell tower just a few yards away, he would not just hear the bells, but also feel their vibrations as their tolling fled the tower and sent some trembling shivers through his fragile frame. A glass of wine with the fathers would calm his nerves. There's a large bell in the Fordham archives that once hung in the church and that, the tradition says, inspired Poe's famous poem, The Bells. Unfortunately for the tradition, contemporaries and scholars have a list of competing churches, such as the Church of the Ascension and Grace Church in Lower Manhattan near the house of Poe's friend Mrs. Shue, who claims he wrote the first 2 verses there. According to another tradition, this bell hung in the cupola of the mansion and called students to class and meals. Poe liked the Jesuits, he told a friend, because they were, quote, highly cultivated gentlemen and scholars. They smoked and they drank and played cards and never said a word about religion. After their walks, the fathers turned Poe loose in their library, where he sometimes lingered so late they would offer him a bed for the night. If, and this happened only rarely, he joined the fathers in a glass of wine and his symptoms began to appear, because he got drunk really, really easily, someone would gently offer an arm and say, "Come, Poe, we will go home now." So that's the story of Edgar Allan Poe and the University Church. Let's get to a couple ghost stories before I close out the episode. So when I was a freshman, I was told a story, I believe by the RAs, about a priest, or maybe a student training to become a priest like a seminarian, who lived in St. John's Hall back when it was a seminary. Content warning for suicide here, just skip forward a minute or so if you don't want to hear about that. I try not to give details about suicides as a general rule, but this is slightly more detailed than I would normally give, just because the story doesn't work if I don't say how this person killed himself. So the story goes that when Queen's Court was a seminary, it was extremely cold in St. John's Hall. One priest, after suffering for a long time, couldn't stand it anymore, so he hanged himself. I was told that when they found him, his feet were banging against the radiator. So nowadays, when you hear the radiators banging, that's supposed to be the ghost of this priest. Okay, so that's silly, because radiators are really loud, especially old ones. It's just a thing in old buildings. My current apartment does the same thing. That being said, my current apartment is haunted, but the haunting has nothing to do with the radiators. A loud radiator in and of itself does not mean that a location is haunted. But it's a fun, creepy story that RAs tell new students, whatever. I even read in a couple books about New York City hauntings, stories of how RAs tell this story to scare freshmen. Like, it's been printed in books. It's a well-known tradition to tell people these stories, but it doesn't mean that these stories are true. So I've always been like, this story is obviously BS made up to scare people. Here's the interesting thing, though, and I didn't know this until I did this research. In his 2016 book, Fordham, A History of the Jesuit University of New York, 1841 to 2003, Thomas J. Shelley writes that after the first 4 or 5 years of the seminary's history, things were going pretty well, but then around 1850, conditions started to deteriorate. So I wanted to read a bit from this book. there were repeated complaints that the poor living conditions in the seminary were impairing the health of the seminarians. One of the professors, Father Isidore Dobresse, admitted that the cold and dampness had led to the death of at least one student, but he claimed that the Jesuits had appealed to the diocese in vain for 3 years to rectify the situation. Moreover, said Dobresse, many of the seminarians came to them in poor health. At vacations outside the seminary during the past several years, he explained to one of his superiors, some of them contracted cholera and other diseases. Should one be surprised then, he asked, that they returned to the seminary in poor health? The book doesn't say if his death was a suicide or not, and it seems that Dobresse never said if it was a suicide or not. But it's cagey and vague, and it seems kind of weird that they weren't like, a student died of cholera or something similar, since they mentioned cholera elsewhere. So I really do wonder if there's some truth to the legend about a seminarian's suicide, at least. And it's one of those things. When part of a seemingly baseless urban legend starts to sound like it may be true, the rest of it suddenly appears in a different light. I'm not trying to say that this means that the banging of the radiators is part of a haunting. I don't think that's true. But it also sort of opens the door for potential other hauntings, right? Like this seminarian who died in the building. Like we know for sure a seminarian died because of bad conditions, unpleasant living conditions in the building back in the mid-19th century. We know that for sure. So to me, this person becomes a candidate for potential other hauntings, if that makes sense. Like we know that someone died in a really unpleasant way. Like he was uncomfortable and suffered until he died. And if you're talking about what creates hauntings, etc., a lot of people agree that that sort of suffering, needless death, the death of a young person, etc., those are all things that often factor into stories of hauntings. So it's one of those things where you pick apart an urban legend and there's a kernel of truth somewhere, but as always with all things in the paranormal, there's just more questions. So this idea of who haunts a place, who's remembered, etc., is something that I'm very interested in. If you're a longtime listener, you know that I'm really preoccupied by the question, why do some spirits or entities supposedly haunt a location and not others? There's an interesting metaphysical question that I don't expect to find an answer to embedded in here, but also there are some other questions that are easier to try to tease out and examine, I think. Those other questions are, why do some locations have certain legends attached to them and not others? Why do some stories survive and others fade out? Why, when some people have paranormal experiences, do they ascribe their cause to a specific historical figure or past resident of an area and not another? The answers to these questions are obviously long and complicated and could yield many hours of healthy debate. But the thing I've noticed is that one major thing seems to inform legends of hauntings. And to me, when a legend is informed by this, they become less credible. Whoever had the greatest level of power and or wealth in an area is more likely to be remembered than someone who had less power or wealth. And as a result, I believe that people are more likely to come up with an explanation behind their paranormal experiences that draw from the stories of the deceased people of an area who were best known. I think it's important to think critically about the stories we tell about hauntings, both from a historical analysis standpoint, but also from the standpoint of trying to assess what you think about the veracity of a claim. And the reason why I bring this up here is because Fordham has had a couple famous visitors who it would be really easy to make up ghost stories about, make up urban legends about, embellish your own experiences with details that lead to the idea that it could have been one of these two famous people who visited campus in Fordham's early history. So the first of those figures is Edgar Allan Poe, of course. And then the second figure is George Washington, who supposedly had a headquarters at the old manor that was where Fordham is now. I'll talk more about that another time, the George Washington story. But I wanted to pause here for a moment and say that it's interesting to me that, to my knowledge, there are no stories about hauntings related to Edgar Allan Poe and George Washington on Fordham's campus, even though it would have been really easy to attribute paranormal experiences to the most famous people on campus. One thing that to me makes Fordham's hauntings more credible than hauntings that I sometimes talk about or read about is that they tend to be about Jesuits or about young students, I assume like prep school students. Those tend to be the entities that are seen when someone sees a figure, like a person, as part of their paranormal experience on campus. And of course, like, it's a Catholic school, there's a lot of priests who live there. It used to be a seminary. There's no reason why stories shouldn't center around these folks. But as you'll see, as I continue this series, there's a pattern in the hauntings being about sort of everyday people. It's not even like typically the president of the university who's seen, like a past president of the university. It's usually just kind of like a random priest or a random, probably prep school student, etc. And to me, that just like makes the hauntings a little bit more credible. It doesn't feel like people are just grasping at straws, trying to have the most impressive ghost stories. And I just think it would be so easy to embellish your way to an urban legend about like when the bells of Fordham rings, you still see Edgar Allan Poe's figure because, he's been heartbroken by his wife's death and he still wanders campus drunkenly or intoxicated by his own depression, whatever. It would be so easy to make up that sort of legend. And to my knowledge, it doesn't exist. And I just think that's, for me, a tally in the mark of credibility next to many of the Fordham hauntings. Like, while it's a school that is somewhat proud of its hauntings and that acknowledges its hauntings, they could have attempted to sort of have more prestigious hauntings or prestigious urban legends of more prestigious people, and that's just not what the stories end up being, which is just really interesting to me. So, I know this episode has been going on for a while, and the next episode will really focus a lot on the hauntings at Queen's Court, but I wanted to tell one more short story of a Queen's Court haunting before I get out of here. So, there's a mention of Alpha House in the bit I'm going to read next, so I want to explain what the heck that is real quick. Today, Alpha House is like a classroom/study lounge for the honors program, but it was originally built in 1864 at the campus entrance at 3rd Avenue and Fordham Road. That's right around where the Fordham Metro North station is now. For years after that, it was the college bookstore, and now it's the honors program building. It is a gatehouse that was built from locally quarried stone, and it was built to test out the stone's quality. It has since been moved to the middle of campus near Hughes Hall, which I'll talk about in a later episode, but the story mentions it, so I just wanted to explain what this is. This comes from the RAM in an article that was published in 1983 and was republished in 85 and 88. I'll read a lot from this article throughout the series. So, to read from that, another ghost who likes to keep tabs on present-day Fordham is the spirit of the groundskeeper. When Alpha House was located at the 3rd Avenue gate entrance at the turn of the century, it was used to house Rose Hill's groundskeeper and his family. One of his duties was to walk around campus at night and make sure all the buildings were secure. It's said that one of his favorite tours was around St. John's Hall, which he used to circle more than once, swinging a small lantern. Reportedly, he can be seen late at night circling the same building today, leisurely checking the doors and swinging his lamp. So that's the fun little story of the groundskeeper ghost. I haven't actually heard of this haunting mentioned anywhere outside of the pages of the RAM, but I think it's a nice, cozy story to close on. I just love the image of this groundskeeper from the 19th century carrying around his lantern, making sure everything is well, watching over things. So I've got a bunch of poltergeist activity to talk about in the next episode, as well as the most famous Queen's Court ghost story, which involves a student talking to a ghost and not realizing it, and that ghost performing a possible exorcism. So come back the week after next for that. In the meantime, you can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can check out the show notes with all of the sources that I used here at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it. Please tell your friends about it. That really helps other people find it. And thanks so much for listening.